Hello, my friend. Last but not least, we're painting the final tiny landscape in our Tiny Parks Painting the Wilderness Challenge, Acadia National Park. Now, this scene might seem really intimidating because there are some pretty defined subjects in each of the layers, both in the foreground where the rocks are, and the midground where the water and the ripples are, and then the background where the trees are. And so I want to tell you first and foremost that the most important thing for this tiny landscape is to break it into doable, bite-sized pieces. Another important thing to remember with small-scale paintings is that sometimes the rules that you use for larger scale paintings might not apply because you kind of have to reorient yourself and simplify so that the painting still makes sense in tiny form. In this case, while I usually as a watercolor painter paint the background first and then the midground and then the foreground, I kind of jumped around from thing to thing in this painting, and so follow along with me and we will practice problem solving when maybe we hit a snag. We will practice really simplifying the background layers so that the foreground layers can jump out at us. And we will practice being kind to ourselves while we do something that is genuinely very tricky. Jumping into this scene from Acadia National Park, I want you to remember that when you're painting really kind of complex subjects like rocks, where there are lots of shadows, lots of crags, it feels kind of tricky to figure out how to give them a shape. We are going to focus on two main rules for depth. The first one is for distance, so depth within the actual scene itself, and that is we're going to make the biggest rocks the ones in the foreground, so along the bottom of the page, and then we're going to make the smallest rocks the ones in the midground or the background. And that's going to help train our eyes to figure out what rocks are closer and what rocks are farther away, and to create that distance. And we're going to sketch those out and keep that in mind when we're sketching our rocks. So I started with a tree line to separate the lake from the trees, and then I realized I put it a little bit too high because I don't want this to be a line between the trees and the sky. I want this to be a line between the lake and the trees. So I put it down about a third of the way across the page. Then I'm going to start with a pencil sketch of some rocks. Now, kind of off to the side on the left-hand side, that's where the rock bank is going to kind of jut into the water, but these are far away rocks, right? And so these rocks are starting out teeny tiny and then they're gradually getting bigger. And I'm composing these rocks in kind of like a C shape, like a C curve. And then it's just kind of elongated. And these rocks are generally kind of flat along the bottom and then along the bottom of the rocks and then rocky along the top, because especially the ones where we can see that there's water, the water line is going to make the bottom of the rocks look like it's flat, but we still want the top of the rock to look kind of like jagged and rocky. So, and I'm only loosely paying attention to the reference photo at this point, just for like maybe some of the rocks. Mostly, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. Leaving some space for the rocks along the bottom for water to come through or shadows, but also clustering the rocks together. Then I'm going to paint an underpainting for this painting. So most of the underpainting is going to be a very light value cerulean. So in the sky and in the lake, a very light value cerulean. I start with water, to just a very light layer of water, but I'm kind of carefully trying to paint around the rocks. It's okay if some of the cerulean gets onto the rocks, that's fine, but mostly I want to keep the rocks white, and also that little strip between the shoreline and where the rocks start, I want to keep that kind of loosely white as well. Then while I'm going to do a very light value Payne's gray or indigo, either one of those, very watery, for one layer of the rocks. So that's the underpainting. Now we're going to start with painting just the base layer for the trees. And this is a very light value Cascade green. Could also use sap green mixed with a little bit of indigo. We're just going for some kind of dark green here. And then while that's still wet, I'm going to take a DIY foliage brush, and just in a few spots, I'm going to tap in some autumn colors. So this is Pyrrol Scarlet, then I'm tapping in gold ochre, and then around the Pyrrol Scarlet and the gold ochre, I'm going to tap in some sap green. So I want the trees not to look entirely full of autumn, like, according to the reference photo, that's kind of what I'm going for here. So, but the reason I tapped in the color first is because I want the colorful trees to still pop. And if I tried to paint those on top of the green, or while the green was on first, they would probably get kind of muddy. So I'm doing the colorful ones first that I want to keep really clear, and then tapping in the green around it. Now remember, we're painting like big clusters of paint to imply trees, right? We don't need it to look exactly like trees. We're just trying to imply. Then after that background layer of trees, there's one little layer of foliage that kind of juts into the scene with the rocks, like kind of as a midground. So painting around the rock sketches that I did before with my pencil, I'm just doing almost like a triangle shape of foliage in that midground. Then I'm going to take my foliage brush and add a lot of indigo to sap green to make this really dark green. And I'm going to start with my foliage brush, and the paint has a little bit of water to it, definitely, so that it spreads a little more. I'm going to paint the reflection on the water. It's going to be really dark. I'm using the foliage brush so I can still get some white streaks kind of naturally, but you can also just use a round number 2. That would be okay. And then toward like the bottom of that reflection, I'm painting just a few like lines, vertical and horizontal, to mimic the look of a treetop reflection. Remember that when you're painting reflections in the water, you want it to look choppy, especially ones that naturally have waves in them. We want them to look choppy. We don't need them to look perfect. Then I'm going to take my foliage brush with some very, very light value Payne's gray, and along that strip of white between the trees and the reflection, that's rock. So I'm going to paint just a few dabs of very, very light value Payne's gray, and then take some slightly darker value, and like along the bottoms of that rocky shore, I'm gonna make it just slightly darker. So this goes along with the second rule for depth that we're going to follow when we're painting things like rocks, which is the first one was distance, right, where it's larger in the front and smaller in the back. The second one is value. So with some, again, kind of light value Payne's gray or indigo, I'm going to paint layers on the rock, and we're starting light, and then we're gradually going to add shadows. So this is kind of a light value watery grayish color, and I'm going to paint the rocks, but I'm going to leave behind little bits of white space from the layer before for highlights, especially for some of those foreground ones. I'm going to leave behind the little bits of white space so that we can create texture. We're creating this rocky texture by starting light and then gradually getting darker. And the more shadows we add, the less paint we need, and the more movement those shadows are going to have. So I did that kind of second layer of the rocks. Now I'm going to start kind of giving shape to the rocks by adding more color to the lake and painting around the rocks. So this is cerulean, and also that dark green. I'm going to use the dark green for like the midground rocks, the ones that are teeny tiny. I'm going to use the dark green to paint around the rocks so that I can kind of shape them so that we can actually see the rocks in the midground. And as a bonus, extend the reflection so it looks pretty cool, right? I'm also going to do the same thing with the foreground rocks, but instead of with the dark green, I'm going to do that with cerulean. So I'm going to very carefully paint around the foreground rocks, so it's more blue toward the bottom, and then it gradually gets lighter blue as it gets to the reflection, and then there's the reflection. Now, when I got to this point, I realized that I think the reflection has too much white space in it, and it's kind of making the scene really busy. There's already a lot of texture and will be with the rocks and with the trees, and so maybe the reflection is a good chance to, I still want to leave a few little strips of white for the waves, but maybe the reflection is a good chance to give some breathing room to the scene, right? By making it more of like a solid texture, like a solid wash. Not entirely, but having that dark solid wash contrast against the more textured rocks and the textured trees. I think between the solid cerulean and the mostly solid dark green, that will really help the scene. So now we're going to go on to the rocks with a slightly darker gray. So this can be Payne's gray mixed with a little bit of burnt umber to make it more like a muted neutral gray. And especially for that foreground rock, I'm going to paint along to the side and then along the bottom with this darker value shadow, and I'm intentionally leaving strips of white space. Now, it doesn't have to be like how it is in the reference photo. I'm kind of like doing curvy triangle shapes, right? So it's kind of like along the bottom and then curves up along the side. The whole thing is we don't want to do just straight lines here. We want the shadows to have movement. So they're mostly along the bottom, sometimes along the side, sometimes even a little along the top, and then leaving out just little teeny spaces of the layer underneath. And then definitely with the cluster of rocks on the left-hand side, in between all of those rocks, we want shadows as well. Then I'm going to take some even slightly darker of those of that gray and paint just a little bit underneath some of the rocks that are especially in kind of like the midground where we can see it has the rock has a reflection in the lake too. And then I'm also going to add some even slightly darker just along the bottom. Now, when we're adding value contrast here, we're darkening up the shadows a little bit. We want the dark shadows to be along the bottom, and the more dark we go, the less paint we need. So we still want all of the layers to shine through. Then, to add just a little bit of interest to the rocks, I took some gold ochre, very, very light value gold ochre, and painted a few splashes of color on the rocks. Then I'm going to take some of that darker green and try to give a little bit of shape to the midground rocks. So I'm painting around with the reflection color so that there's more solid shadow, more solid reflection around the rocks that I really want to pop, because the more white space in the reflection, the less those rocks are going to stand out. So finally, I'm going to add some darker green to the foliage, both on that midground foliage off to the side, and then also with the foliage in the background, so the trees in the background. I'm just going to add some darker green along the bottoms to make the foliage kind of have even a little bit more depth and have them pop. I also added some gold ochre to that midground one to kind of brighten it up a bit. Unfortunately, I think it just made it more muddy because I added some gold ochre and some Pyrrol Scarlet, and it just made everything kind of a big muddy mess. So if I were to do that again, I would probably like mop all of that up and then have more white space to make that midground scene a little bit more bright. But you know, as it is, it's fine the way that it is. Then for the background foliage, just along the bottom, I'm using that foliage brush to add some darker greens, also some darker reds, only along the bottoms and maybe, you know, up the sides of the trees just a little bit. That's going to make it look like there's shadows in between the trees. And remember, this is a teeny painting. These trees are in the distance. We don't need them to look perfect. We don't need them to look like it's going to be a better painting if we intentionally simplify, right? Especially in the background. We want the most detail along the rocks along the bottom. I'm also going to take some of that dark green and just paint a few like little blades of grass in between some of, especially the foreground rocks, to give it just a little more detail, right? And also to fill in some space, especially if you felt like those rocks look just kind of meh. Adding a little bit of grass in between can really make those details pop as well. And that's it. We're all done. The details that we really, really focused on in this scene were color values, right? Like size and color values. We're starting light and then we're gradually getting darker with a few layers at a time. We're also intentionally smoothing out spaces like the lake, like the reflection, like the sky above the trees, smoothing out spaces that don't need as much texture, even if you can see more detail in the reference photo. In our painting, we're smoothing them out intentionally so that the subjects we really want to have texture, like the leaves and like the rocks, can really stand out and not get too cluttered or, you know, get lost in a really noisy scene. And we're starting lighter than we think we need to, and then we're gradually getting darker. And the darker we go, the less paint we need. Unless, of course, we're talking about that, like, you know, the big reflection space. But I hope you had so much fun with this one. Let's think about what we loved and what we learned. I really loved the shadows on the rocks. I think that it's one of my favorite things to see rocks come together when you start with just like one layer of really light paint and then you add another layer of slightly darker paint, and then you keep adding the shadows along the bottom and the rock just kind of forms. I thought that looked really cool. I also loved the foliage brush. I used the foliage brush for a lot of painting here, and I think that was a good time. Something that I learned that really cemented this technique for me was that in order to make really light subjects like rocks in that midground pop, you want to use a dark negative space like the reflection to paint around it so that those light subjects really stand out, even if they're in the midground. I also learned that it's okay to jump around. We don't have to have it be like strictly back to front with everything. We can just kind of paint as we need to and add little details that make the whole scene pop. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for painting with me, my friends. As always, it is my honor and privilege to get to paint with you, to get to share creativity with you and a love for landscapes, as is a very prominent theme in my newest book, National Parks in Watercolor. You are not a camera. You are a painter, and it's okay that you are a painter and your paintings look like paintings. And I hope you give yourself so much grace and freedom to let go of the pull toward perfectionism and lean into the pull toward creativity, because truly what you are creating and the energy that you're embodying is beautiful, and it's making the world a more beautiful place. So thank you so much once again for painting with me. I hope it's not the last time, and I'll see you again soon.